Hello, welcome to EPG Pathshala, this postgraduate e-Pathshala. And the course we are welcoming you to is Introduction to Linguistics. Today the module is called Infant and Child Language Acquisition. My name is Amrita Valli. I'm a professor at the English and Foreign Languages University in Hyderabad. Now, up until the generative revolution in linguistics, which we talked about in the first module, the Chomskyan revolution, it had been thought that children learn language by imitating adults. So let's start with that question. Do children learn language by imitating adults? We now believe that this is not a true picture of language acquisition. And the first argument that children do not learn language by imitating adults is that children make mistakes when they begin to speak language. These are interesting mistakes, they amuse the adults, but certainly these are not mistakes that they ever hear in the language spoken to them by adults. So if they were simply imitating adults, they would not be making these mistakes. What mistakes do they make? We don't call them mistakes so much as creative errors, because we believe that the child recreates language, and in the course of recreation, the child makes some creative errors. So let's look at some of these creative errors. These are all from the research on language acquisition, and they are drawn from English, but you can find other language samples as well. A child says, "How would you flat it?" What the child means is, how would you flatten it? How would you make it flat? Another child says, "Down your little knee." What the child wants to say is, put your little knee down. Again, a causative use of the verb is what the child wants. A third child says, "Don't eat her yet." Can you guess what they want to say? They want to say, "Don't feed her yet." Eat is used for make her eat. Another child, or maybe the same child says, "I'm singing him." And you can guess, he's trying to say, "I'm making him sing." "She came it over here." Now you can easily guess the target utterance, as we call it. The target utterance is, she brought it over here. She made it come over here. So you've seen that in all these examples, the child has used a non-causative form of the verb to convey a causative meaning. They have used a verb like flat instead of flatten, an adjective like flat instead of flatten, a particle or preposition like down instead of the verb particle construction put down, eat instead of feed or make her eat, sing instead of make sing, and came instead of bring. The meaning of bring is to make something come. You bring a book, you make the book come to class, for example. Such errors are evidence that the children are not simply imitating adults, because no adult user of English uses the words in this way. Now, interestingly, causative verbs are an error-prone area. We have examples of such errors in Japanese and also in Tamil, which is spoken in the south of India. And here we find similar errors. The Japanese children between the ages of 2 and 4, they use an intransitive verb instead of its transitive or causative counterpart. A Tamil child, this example is taken from the Vanita corpus. This is a corpus of utterances of a child called Vanita. It is available on the Max Planck Institute website. This child says something like, "Nee onjute." ni wonjute, which actually means you broke. But what the child is trying to say is that you broke the bangle. She's wearing a bangle which scratches her, and she's accusing her father. She's telling the father, you broke that bangle. So the adult utterance would be ni wodachute. Ni wonjute, ni wodanjute, which means you broke, you got broken. Ni wodachute, which means you broke it. So here again the child is using the intransitive verb instead of the causative verb. Another Tamil child, and this is from a corpus that we collected at our institution, the child says the Tamil equivalent of I have come up. Vandutta nana is what the child says. What is the context in which he says this? He is playing with the toy toaster, the thing which toasts bread, and the bread pops up. In this case, the bread has popped up. He has made the bread pop up, and he wants to say, Varavachute, I've made it pop up. Varavachute nane, and he says, now vandutta nane. So you can see that in the area of causative verbs, children make a lot of errors, and the errors are quite similar across languages. But what is even more interesting about child language is that there is at least one kind of error that the child never makes. Now, to understand why we are saying this, we have to understand a little bit about the adult grammar. In this case, we will take English as an example. Consider a very well-known example in the linguistics literature. It is the example of how you make a yes-no question in English out of a statement. So look at this little grammar. The statement or the declarative sentence is, the man is coming. The corresponding yes-no question is the man coming? The man is coming. Is the man coming? What could be simpler? How do you state the rule which relates the statement or the declarative sentence to the yes-no question? There are many, many ways in which you can go wrong. One way in which you can go wrong is to simply say, move the verb is to the front of the sentence. Suppose you say simply, move the verb is to the front of the sentence, or move the third word to the front of the sentence. Now take a slightly more complicated sentence. The man who is tall is coming. The man who is tall is coming. How many is words are there in that sentence? The man who is tall, that's one is over there, is coming. That's another is over there. Now if your rule says simply move the verb is to the front of the sentence, and suppose you assume that it is the first is that you see that you should move, what would you say? Is the man who tall is coming? Is the man who tall is coming? And everybody knows that this is garbage. It just doesn't make any sense at all. Why doesn't this sentence make any sense? Which is should move? How do we know? Let's look at some more complicated, the same kind of examples but made much more complicated. So let's look at a series of examples. The man who is tall is coming. Two is are there. The man who is the brother of the man who is tall is coming. How many is are there? You can count. You're seeing it on your screen. Who is the brother? One is. Of the man who is tall, the second is coming. You can go on adding words, adding clauses, adding sentences to this. The man who is the friend of the man who is the brother of the man who is tall is coming. Let's take that sentence. The man who is the friend of the man who is the brother of the man who is tall is coming. If you remember the sentence, you will make the yes-no question. Is the man who is the friend of the man who is the brother of the man who is tall coming? So, In every case, you move the is, which belongs to the verb of the main clause of the sentence. No matter how many is's intervene, nobody has to tell you which is has to move to the front. So the rule which moves the is cannot simply say move is. It cannot simply say move the first is, or the second is, or the third is, because you can put in any number of such words into the sentence. The rule seems to look at what is the subject of the sentence, what is the main verb of the sentence. I'm using the terminology from traditional grammar here, but in generative grammar, we would say, look at the tree structure, as you can see now on the screen. If you draw the tree, the sentence structure, for a simple sentence like, the man is coming, the man is the subject, is coming is the predicate or the verb phrase. They are both at the same level in the sentence. Now when you put in a clause like who is coming, that is a clause which belongs within the subject. The man is coming. You're describing the man further. The man who is tall is coming. So the first is lower in the sentence because it's within the subject. It comes, as you can see on the tree, it comes lower in the sentence. Hierarchically, it is lower. So you can see that somewhere we seem to arrange these words in our mind in a hierarchical structure. Now suppose the child does not start out with this premise, with this assumption. Suppose the child starts out with the assumption that all the words are put together into a sentence the way beads are strung on a necklace. All the beads are equally strung on the same thread. Then the child will have no way of making this rule correctly, because this rule appeals to the hierarchical structure of the sentence. To make a yes-no question that corresponds to a statement, you have to find the verb, the auxiliary verb you can call it, which comes within the main verb of the sentence, which comes in the main clause of the sentence, and which not any verb which comes inside the subject verb noun phrase, like in a relative clause and so on. Now, interestingly, the kinds of mistakes I've been talking about that you could make are never made by children. They're not made in first language acquisition, and I can tell you they're not made in second language acquisition either. We make a lot of mistakes when we try to learn English, but this kind of mistake I don't think we ever make. We know instinctively which verb to move. And this is what we call universal grammar. This instinct, the language instinct, is the name of a book by Steven Pinker. Okay? So what we are calling universal grammar, a faculty of language which is in the mind and so on, in more informal language you can refer to it as the language instinct. And you know immediately, intuitively, that the other things are wrong and this is the word to move. So this is a kind of mistake that the child doesn't make. Now this is important because a lot of advance in science is made by imagining what does not happen. Until Newton is supposed to have asked the question, why do apples fall? Until he asked that question, it was taken for granted that if you don't support a thing and leave it, it will fall. You know, it took a mind like Newton's to wonder, what happens? Imagine a world where things don't fall. Now, he asked that question about 4 centuries ago. Today we know that in space, things do not fall. Okay, they float. So similarly, in child language acquisition, it is an important point that the child never seems to entertain a rule which simply thinks of the words in a sentence as arranged one after the other linearly like beads on a string. The child seems to instinctively understand that I have to find the verb which goes with the subject of the sentence. Those two are at the same level of the hierarchy. So we have now seen that children do make some kinds of errors, but there are also kinds of errors that the children never make when they learn language. And we believe that the kinds of errors that children do not make when they learn language are the kinds, they relate to principles of language, principles of universal grammar. What about the errors that children do make? Can we correct them? Let's look at that. The evidence that we have from looking at children's interaction with their parents tells us that parents listen to the child's speech for the content of what the child is saying, and therefore they reward the child, meaning they give him approval if the child says something which is true, and they do not reward the child, they disapprove if the child says something which is not true. They do not pay attention so much to whether what the child says is grammatical or not. So for example, these are two examples from the literature. The child says, "Daddy car," meaning that's daddy's car. This is a 2-year-old child. He doesn't yet have all the words that make a sentence. And the mother says approvingly, "Yes, that's daddy's car." Nobody says to a 2-year-old child, "You're not speaking properly, say it in a complete sentence." But in another instance from the literature, a child says, "That's my toy." And the mother immediately says, "No, it's not." So parents do not correct a child for the correctness of the language. They correct a child for the truth or otherwise of what the child is saying. Not only that, we have very interesting and amusing examples in the literature that it is quite useless to correct a child. We're talking about child language acquisition, how children learn their first language, their mother tongue. We're not talking about teaching language in school at this point. Now, there is a very famous interchange between a child and a parent, Martin Brain, who was a linguist. The child asks for another 1 spoon, another 1 spoon. And you all know that he should say another spoon. So the linguist parent wants to see what happens if I correct the child. So he tells the child, "Say another spoon." The child says another 1 spoon. This goes on. 4 or 5 times it goes on. The 6th time, and the parent has not given the child a spoon all this time. He's withholding the spoon. So he says to the child, "Listen to me carefully. Listen to me. Say another spoon." So the child listens very carefully and says, "Another spoon. Now can I have another 1 spoon, please?" So, the child says something, but it's not part of its real grammar. So it's just saying something to please the father. Until I say this like this, the father won't give me the child. "Now can I have another 1 spoon, please?" I've had personal experience of this. There was a child who was singing one of these jingles, television jingles. And the child was saying, "Kmart is the da place." Now, I knew that he was missing a word. So I told him, it's Kmart is the saving place. So the child looked at me and then started to sing. Kmart is the da saving place. So, this is a very common response that children have to error correction, where they will take your correction and not really understand what you're trying to tell them, and they'll put their own language in as well, so they have both the old and the new together. Look at what happens in the next example on the screen. A similar thing happens. The child says, "Nobody don't like me." The child means to say, "Nobody likes me." That's the target utterance. So the parent corrects the child. "Say, nobody likes me." And the child suddenly understands what he has to say. "Oh," he says, "nobody don't likes me." So you see, the error correction just leads to more error. Because the child is speaking, as we said, we think that the child creates the language. The child creates the language on the basis of what he hears and the innately specified principles of grammar. So somewhere, if he has a certain principle which is slightly wrong, well, not a principle, a certain rule of grammar which is slightly wrong, then he produces what is non-standard in the target language. And when you try to correct the child doesn't see how it fits in with his grammar in his own mind. So the child has to correct his own grammar. That's what we're trying to say. Now, children must therefore correct themselves when they go wrong, and this is called the absence of negative evidence in the literature. What do we mean by negative evidence? Negative evidence is evidence that something is wrong. Now, think of, for example, we talked about the yes-no question and the principle of hierarchy. When it comes to principles, there is no negative evidence available to the child because the wrong sentences simply never get spoken. To take the analogy of the apple falling, Newton had to simply imagine what happens if an apple doesn't fall. In a world where apples don't fall, what is the difference? Because in the world that you know, things always fall. You never have the alternative world where things don't fall. So similarly, in the world of language, sentences are always hierarchical in structure. They're never like beads on a string in structure. So if the child starts off with the wrong hypothesis, there's absolutely no way they can go back. And that is why we say that that is inbuilt, that they have the idea that sentences are hierarchically structured. Now we have seen that in other errors, even though they are corrected, they fail to really understand the correction and they fail to correct themselves. So children's language somehow corrects itself in the absence of negative evidence. And therefore, language acquisition is a classic case of Plato's problem. What was Plato's problem? How do we know as much as we know, given that our interactions with the world are so limited and fragmentary? To understand this problem, think of how we talk as adults. Oh, the syllabus that you studied was quite different from the syllabus that I studied, so I don't know those things. We can say something like that. Imagine a child trying to say that about language. Every child has access only to its own family or its own parents or its own society. But every child learns language to a degree where it can communicate with other speakers of that language. So we talked about the uniformity of language acquisition. So the knowledge of language that the child acquires on the basis of its individualized, limited, fragmentary experience is far greater than what could have been got from experience alone. This is why we say that language learning is an instance of Plato's problem. So when we investigate child language, therefore, there are many methods and techniques. But one very significant kind of research that is done in child language acquisition is to find out whether children respect the principles of UG. So we look for evidence that children somehow realize that language has structure. What is the kind of evidence you can look for? One way, for example, is to look for whether they see the ambiguity in sentences such as, they fed her dog biscuits. They fed her dog biscuits. What does it mean? Can you see that this sentence has two meanings? They fed her dog biscuits. They fed her dog biscuits. Okay? In one case, they feed someone dog biscuits. In the other case, they feed someone's dog biscuits. This means that you have to put two different kinds of structure on this string of words. That structure is not evident in the sentence that you hear. The sentence doesn't come to you with labeled bracketing. It doesn't come to you with annotations. Your mind has to see that there are two possible ways of understanding this sentence. Now, once your mind sees that, that means that your mind is assigning two kinds of what we call structural descriptions to that sentence. So, we are very interested in finding out, do children understand these kinds of ambiguities? At what age do they understand these kinds of ambiguities? And so on. Another way in which you can investigate a child's knowledge of UG principles is by looking at principles that we know apply in the adult grammar. For example, pronominal coreference. What do we mean by pronominal coreference? You know what a pronoun is. Let's take he. He, she, it, these are all pronouns. Now, a pronoun can stand instead of a noun. He came, somebody came. But it can also refer back in the sentence to another noun. So, the man came, he sat down. It can mean that the same person who came in sat down. So, he can refer to the man. Now, interestingly, in a hierarchical structure, the pronoun has to be lower than the name for it to be co-referential. So look at these two sentences. After he danced, Kermit ate a cookie. Kermit is one of these Sesame Street puppets. I think you must have seen or heard about the Sesame Street programs in the United States of America. So a lot of child language literature which comes from America has these kinds of puppets. They use these puppets to get the child to say what he thinks, and that is why we have Kermit in this sentence. So when you say after he danced, Kermit ate a cookie, he can be Kermit, right? You can understand that Kermit danced and then ate a cookie. Now compare a sentence like, he danced after Kermit ate a cookie. He danced after Kermit ate a cookie. In this sentence, he cannot mean Kermit. Why not? In both cases, he comes before Kermit. After he danced, Kermit ate a cookie. He danced after Kermit ate a cookie. So in both sentences, he comes before Kermit. But in the first sentence, after he danced, Kermit ate a cookie. After he danced is what we call in traditional terms a subordinate clause. Whereas in he danced after Kermit ate a cookie, the main clause is he danced and the subordinate clause is after Kermit ate a cookie. So in the first sentence, Kermit is higher in the tree, in the position in the tree than he. Whereas in the second sentence, he is higher in the tree structure than Kermit. And this makes a difference about whether or not he and Kermit can refer to each other, whether he can be co-referential with Kermit or not. How do we find out whether children see these sentences in the same way as we do? And we want to test fairly young children, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds. We want to see whether they can understand what we understand when we hear these sentences. So one way of doing this is a task that has been invented by Stephen Crane, and this task is called the truth value judgment task. Here, children are shown a small story which is acted out with toys. I told you Kermit is a Muppet from Sesame Street, so you have these Muppets and you act a small story out. Now, another Muppet or toy in the story says things, it comments on the story. It sometimes says things that are true and sometimes it says things that are not true. And you tell the child, this Muppet sometimes makes mistakes, scold it when it makes mistakes and reward it, give it a chocolate when it says the right thing. So the child enjoys doing this task. The child doesn't realize that we are testing the child in some way. So suppose you act out a story where Kermit first dances and then what does he do? He eats a cookie. And then this other Muppet, which sometimes makes mistakes, says, he danced after Kermit ate a cookie. Now that is not a true description of what happened. So if the child also realizes this, the child immediately says, no, no, that's not right. Whereas if the Muppet says, after he danced, Kermit ate a cookie, then the child says, that's right, and he gives this Muppet a chocolate. Okay? So that's how this truth-value judgment task works. Now, there are many ways in which we can test children's knowledge, but this is just one. The other question we have is, why do errors occur at all? You know, given all our claims about what language is, first we said that every human being has language. Language is universal. So the question arose, why doesn't every human being speak the same language? We have so many languages in the world, more than 5,000 to 6,000 languages. So then we explained that, well, there is a narrow margin within which languages can vary, and so there are invariant principles and there are parameters along which people can speak differently, and that makes for the variety of languages. So similarly, with respect to child language, we have said there are certain kinds of errors that children never make. For example, errors on principles like hierarchy. But there are also errors that children make, as we saw. So one question that arises is, why do children make these errors? All kinds of answers have been proposed. One answer is that children's errors in fact show us that the child is continually accessing universal grammar. You see, we know that universal grammar allows languages to vary. So the child has to use his knowledge, unconscious knowledge of universal grammar, to build up a grammar of the particular language that he is exposed to. In that process, the errors which happen are errors which are allowed in other languages. They are structures which are allowed in other languages but are errors in this particular language. Okay? So for example, take an example like seen often in English acquisition. When I can eat? What the child wants to say is, when can I eat? What has happened? I can eat. When I can eat becomes, the can has to move and it comes to the front of the sentence and you get, when can I eat? So you don't pronounce it in its original position, you move it and you pronounce it in the moved position. Now interestingly, there are languages, it appears, in the world where when you move an element, you pronounce it in both places. So when a child says, when I can eat? It isn't wrong from the point of view G. It is wrong from the point of view of English. So one explanation is that a child's errors arise because of its access to UG. At this point, the child is speaking any potential language and not English in particular. That's one explanation. Another point which has been made recently about children's errors, and these are errors that have been collected over the last 50 years or so in child language, not only in English, although in this course our examples are mainly from English because that is the language in which we are teaching the course. But when you get into the literature, you'll see many more other languages represented. When you look at all these errors of children, you'll find that there are many more errors of omission. That is, children do not say things or do not put in grammatical markers and so on, than there are errors of commission. That is where children say the wrong thing. So one hypothesis is that the child is grammatically conservative. He doesn't do something until he has evidence for it in his particular language. An earlier idea, very similar to this, was called the subset principle. That is, imagine two kinds of languages. One language has a grammar which is a subset of the grammar of the second language. For example, English has fixed word order. Most of our languages have something called a normal word order, and in addition they have scrambled word orders or free word orders. So our languages have a grammar which allows both a normal word order and different kinds of word orders, whereas English allows only the fixed word order. So our languages have a grammar which is larger than that of English with respect to word order. Suppose the child started out with the idea that all languages have the larger grammar, he would have to somehow, when he wanted to speak English, go back to the idea that English does not allow all kinds of word orders. But then the evidence for that will not be available because, as we said, negative evidence is not there. So he'll all the time get evidence for the word order of English, but he'll never get evidence that English does not allow free scrambling as we do. So the idea is the child starts with the smaller grammar of English, start with the fixed word order, and then when he finds evidence in our languages that, oh, you can put those words in some other places, then he starts to do that. That's one kind of idea about how children learn languages. So far we've been talking about children after the age of one would say, because at around the age of 1 they speak their first words, and much of what I've been saying concerns children around the age of 2, between 2 and 3. But children's language has been investigated even in infants. I won't go in much detail into this. A lot of it concerns their knowledge of the sound structure of their language. I'll just mention one interesting point about children's knowledge of sound structures, and this is this. Not all languages have all sounds which are used in that language in a contrastive way. I'm sure you are familiar with this idea. Universal grammar allows a whole variety of sounds. Each language picks up some of those sounds to make contrasts in its own lexicon or words in that language. Now, as we grow older, we become so used to our own languages that we don't even hear the contrasts in some other language. For example, in Hindi, we have a p-ph, b-bh contrast. P-ph, both are voiceless, but one is aspirated. P-b, one is voiced and one is voiceless. P is voiceless, b is voiced. B-bh, b is voiced and aspirated, b is only voiced. So we have a four-way contrast. P-ph, b-bh. English has only a two-way contrast here. P and b. And what they hear as p is p. If you say p, they hear it as b. I mean, these are all well-known phenomena in adult speech perception in English. Now, when you look at young children, there are ways of testing very young infants below the age of 9 months to find out whether they can hear all these contrasts. And it turns out that children below the age of 9 months are universal listeners. That is, they seem to hear every contrast possible, whether or not that contrast is useful for them in their own language or not. So an English-speaking child will be able to discriminate between p-ph and b-bh, whereas an adult English speaker, as I told you, p is heard as b and p is what is heard as the voiceless sound. Again, a Japanese child, it is a famous anecdotal evidence that Japanese does not have the distinction between r and l. We call these sounds liquids. And if you hear their own language, you'll see that they make a sound which is somewhere in between to our ears, between r and l. So they find it difficult to discriminate between r and l. But infants Japanese infants below 9 months of age can discriminate these sounds. So until the age of 9 months, a child is a universal listener. What happens after that? After that, the child starts to produce the first words in its own language. So around that time, when the child starts to acquire the words of its own language, the child stops being a universal listener. You find that after the age of 9 months, children seem to discriminate the sound contrasts only of their own language. They stop being universal listeners. Now, when people first found this out, they were very surprised because it's contradictory to another very well-known fact about language acquisition, and this is that until about the age of 7 or 8, a child will acquire a foreign language without a foreign accent. You know this. You go to the US, your child also goes to the US. The child comes back speaking like a little American. You still speak like you always did, perhaps with some changes, but you certainly don't speak exactly like the Americans do. But a child below the age of 8 or 7 or 8, usually you find, will almost exactly pick up language as it is spoken, even if it is a second language. Now, see, we're getting contradictions here because we're saying that until the age of 7 or 8, the child can actually pick up language with an accent, to put it informally, of a foreign language. Whereas in your experiment on sound, we found that the child stops being a universal listener at the age of 9 months. So how can that be true? So then people did a whole series of experiments, and they found that what really happens is between 9 months and 4 years, when the child is picking up its own language, that is the critical time when the child is tuned into its own language and tuned out of other languages. After the age of 4, the child again becomes much more universally attuned. So we have what we call a U-shaped developmental curve. Why do we call it a U-shaped developmental curve? What we found was the child starts as a universal listener. He's up at this height. Around the age of 9 months, the child stops being a universal listener. His ability to discriminate the sounds goes down. He can discriminate only the sounds of his own language. He comes down. He loses that ability. Around the age of 4 years, again, the child is able to discriminate sounds that he had lost the ability to discriminate. So it's a U-shaped developmental curve. This U-shaped developmental curve is found very often in child language acquisition, not only in phonology, but also in morphology. So we've spoken about UG principles, the child's knowledge of UG principles. We've spoken about mistakes that the child can make. We've spoken about the kinds of errors that the child makes and the futility of error correction. There are many more things about child language that we do not have time to speak about today. For example, how does the child learn words? When you see what the child is doing as word learner, he seems to learn words at an astonishing rate. We have evidence that by the age of 6, the child knows about 14,000 words. If you count as words every inflected form of a word, for example, past tense, present tense, plural, singular, etc. He knows about 14,000 words. Even if you put all those inflected words together and say, okay, we'll count that only as one word, we'll count boy and boys as one word, came, come, have come, etc. as one word, the child knows 8,000 words by the time he's 6 years old. And that means, when did he learn those words? If you assume that he puts in 8 hours a day learning words at the rate of, for about 18 months, starting at about 18 months, the child must have been learning 9 new words a day, which is a very, very rapid way of acquiring words. So there is more to word learning. This is an entire area in itself about how children learn words. I've just tried to tell you the magnitude of the problem and that it is worth investigating. And there are all kinds of other questions also about semantics, how children understand ambiguities and so on, which we will cover perhaps when we go into more detail into language acquisition. So for today, we will stop with reminding ourselves that I think we've already said all this, that children respect UG. Even the errors they make seem to be due to UG. There are some kinds of errors the children don't make, and we can give up the idea that children learn language by imitating adults. Thank you.